The moment that stunned everyone didn't happen in front of cameras, it happened in the seconds after the audio played. The exact moment Prince Harry reportedly froze, stared across the room, and then quietly walked out, leaving behind whispers, shock, and one question echoing louder than anything else: what exactly was on that tape about Meghan Markle, and why was Kevin Costner suddenly at the center of it all?
No, Meghan is not invited to my upcoming Santa Barbara event. I have no involvement with the Epstein matter. Prince Andrew and Meghan do. She made an advance toward me. I did not respond.
Just when everything seemed to be settling, when the narrative around the Sussexes looked like it was finally stabilizing, something shifted, quietly at first, almost invisible. But then it exploded into a storm that no one in Hollywood or inside royal circles could ignore anymore. It didn't begin with headlines. It didn't begin with statements. It began with a room, a private gathering, the kind of place where conversations are never supposed to leave the walls. But this time, something slipped out, something recorded, something that, according to insiders, was never meant to be heard. And suddenly, everything changed. Because the moment that audio began circulating, not publicly, not officially, but quietly among a select group of powerful figures, reactions started spreading faster than facts. Phones lit up, conversations paused mid-sentence, and somewhere in the middle of that ripple effect was Harry. Not smiling for cameras, not delivering speeches, but reportedly sitting there, listening. And then, silence. Because what insiders claim happened next wasn't dramatic in the loud sense. There were no raised voices, no public confrontation, just a shift in energy so sharp that people felt it without anyone saying a word. The kind of silence that doesn't calm a room, it freezes it. The kind of silence that makes people look at each other, not knowing who should speak first. And then he stood up. No announcement, no explanation, just a quiet exit that, according to those who noticed, said more than anything he could have said out loud. Because walking out like that, in a room like that, at a moment like that, isn't just leaving. It's a signal. But a signal of what? Because the real tension didn't just come from Harry's reaction, it came from what was being whispered about that audio itself. The words leak and recording were already enough to spark attention. But when those whispers started tying the situation back to Kevin Costner, that's when the story began twisting into something much bigger than anyone expected. Because Costner isn't just another celebrity voice floating around Hollywood gossip. He's someone whose name carries weight, someone who doesn't usually step into chaos, which is exactly why his alleged connection to this moment made it feel intentional. And suddenly, people started connecting dots. Dots that may or may not have been there, but once they were imagined, they became impossible to ignore. Because insiders began hinting that the tension at that Santa Barbara circle hadn't been random, that the distance, the short exchanges, the controlled interactions might have been leading up to something that was now somehow being heard. And that's when the story stopped being about a single event and started becoming about a pattern where doors that once opened easily for Harry and Meghan now seemed to hesitate, where invitations weren't as automatic, where conversations became shorter, where energy shifted in ways that couldn't be explained publicly but could definitely be felt privately. And in Hollywood, that kind of shift is everything, because this isn't an industry that announces rejection. It doesn't slam doors, it just stops opening them. And now people were asking, was this the moment that change became undeniable? Because while Harry was reportedly walking out of that room, the ripple outside was only beginning. Quiet discussions started happening behind closed doors in Los Angeles, among executives, among agents, among people who measure risk the way others measure opportunity. And the word risk began appearing in conversations where it hadn't been before. Not confirmed, not stated officially, but present. Because when something like a secret audio enters the conversation, whether verified or not, it doesn't just stay contained. It spreads, it grows, it transforms into perception, and perception in Hollywood is currency. And suddenly that perception was being reevaluated. At the same time, across the ocean, a different kind of tension was building. Because whenever anything even remotely controversial touches the Sussex name, it doesn't stay in California, it echoes back to London. And this time, it echoed louder. Because palace observers, advisors, and insiders who track reputation like it's a fragile structure began quietly watching the situation, not reacting publicly, not confirming anything, but watching, because they've seen this pattern before, where something starts small, almost dismissible, and then grows into something that can't be ignored anymore. And now, the question wasn't just about what was on that audio, it was about what it could become. Because for Harry, this wasn't just another headline, it wasn't just another moment of media noise, it was personal, deeply personal, because every controversy that touches Meghan eventually touches him, and eventually essentially pulls him into a position where he has to choose how to respond or whether to respond at all. And this time, his response, if those insiders are to be believed, wasn't words. It was walking away. But walking away from what exactly? From the room? From the situation? Or from something much bigger that had been building quietly behind the scenes for longer than anyone realized? Because as this story continued spreading, another layer began forming. One that had nothing to do with the audio itself and everything to do with what came after. Because people started noticing something else. A shift in Harry's appearances. More solo moments. More independent engagements. More situations where Meghan wasn't present, not visibly, not publicly. And in a world where every appearance is analyzed, that absence started speaking. Not loudly, not officially, but clearly enough for those watching closely. And suddenly, a new question entered the conversation. Not what was said on that tape, but what happens next. Because if this moment, this walkout, this audio, this sudden shift in tone is just the beginning, then what comes after could be even bigger. And that's the part no one seems to have the answer to yet. Because behind the scenes, the conversations haven't stopped. They've only gotten quieter. And quieter conversations are often the ones that matter the most. And that's exactly where things take an even darker turn. Because what happens after a moment like that isn't silence. It's interpretation. It's speculation. It's quiet conclusions being drawn behind doors that never open to the public, and in those spaces, the story doesn't slow down, it accelerates. Because the question no one is asking out loud, but everyone is thinking, is this: if that audio was strong enough to make Prince Harry walk out without a word, then what kind of narrative is now forming around Meghan Markle? And who exactly benefits from it being heard? And suddenly, the attention begins shifting away from the moment itself and toward the reaction chain it triggered. Because in Hollywood and royal circles alike, the aftermath is always more revealing than the event. Because within hours, yes, hours, there were whispers of people distancing themselves, not dramatically, not publicly, but subtly, strategically. The kind of distancing that doesn't make headlines but quietly changes outcomes. Where meetings get postponed, where calls become shorter, where enthusiasm becomes cautious, and where opportunities that once felt inevitable begin to feel uncertain. And at the center of that ripple still stands Kevin Costner, a name that keeps resurfacing in conversations, not because of what he confirmed, but because of what he didn't deny. And in a world where silence can be louder than statements, that silence began to take on a life of its own. Because insiders started asking, was this leak accidental or was it allowed to circulate? And that question alone began opening doors to a much bigger theory, one that suggests this wasn't just a random moment, but a controlled shift, a repositioning of influence within circles that rarely reveal their intentions directly. And while that theory remains unspoken publicly, it is being dissected privately, especially among those who understand how quickly perception can be reshaped when the right narrative enters the right room at the right time. Because at the same time, something else began happening that only the most observant people noticed. Something that didn't involve statements or interviews or press releases, but instead involved timing, appearance, and absence. Because Prince Harry began showing up in places where his identity felt different, where he wasn't being framed as part of a duo, but as an individual reconnecting with a version of himself that many believed had been overshadowed in recent years. His engagements began leaning back toward service, toward veterans, toward causes that carried weight beyond media narratives, and in those moments, something shifted in how he was being perceived again, not as part of a controversy, but as a figure trying to reclaim stability in the middle of chaos. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, started raising even more questions, because was this intentional or was it a natural reaction to the storm surrounding him? Was he stepping forward or stepping away? And the deeper this question went, the more it started connecting to something even bigger. Because behind palace walls, where every external controversy is measured against internal stability, conversations were reportedly becoming more serious, more calculated, and more focused on long-term impact rather than short-term noise. Because there is one thing the institution has learned over decades, it's not the headline that causes damage, it's the accumulation of unresolved moments. And this felt like one of those moments. Because even if the audio itself remains unverified, even if its contents are never officially confirmed, the reaction to it is already shaping perception. And perception, once shifted, is incredibly difficult to reverse. And so the focus inside those walls isn't on proving or disproving what was said, but on preparing for what people might believe was said. And that distinction changes everything. Because belief spreads faster than fact. And once it spreads, it creates pressure. And pressure forces decisions that might never have been considered under normal circumstances. circumstances. And suddenly, discussions that once felt theoretical start becoming practical. Because when reputation is at stake, nothing remains off the table forever, and while no official moves have been made, the fact that scenarios are even being examined tells you everything you need to know about how seriously this situation is being taken behind the scenes. Because what began as a quiet gathering in Santa Barbara has now evolved into a multi-layered narrative stretching across continents, industries, and institutions, each interpreting the same moment through a different lens, each preparing for outcomes that may or may not materialize, but must be considered anyway. And in the middle of all of this, one figure remains suspended between two worlds, one that shaped him and one he chose to build, and right now, those two worlds don't seem to be moving in the same direction anymore. Because in Hollywood, where image determines access, the conversation has already begun shifting from admiration to evaluation, and in the royal sphere, where tradition determines continuity, the conversation has shifted from tolerance to caution. And when both of those shifts happen at the same time, it creates a kind of pressure that is impossible to ignore. And that's why this moment feels different, because it's not just about what happened, it's about what it represents. A turning point where private tensions become public narratives, where subtle changes become visible patterns, and where one unexpected leak can trigger a chain reaction that no one can fully control once it begins. And now, as the dust refuses to settle, as conversations continue in rooms we'll never see, as decisions are weighed without ever being announced, one final question lingers, heavier than all the rest. Was this just another passing controversy in a long line of headlines, or was this the moment everything quietly began to change? Because if the walkout was real, if the reactions were genuine, and if the ripple continues spreading the way it has, then what we're witnessing might not be the peak of the story, it might just be the beginning of something far bigger, something still unfolding, something that hasn't revealed its final shape yet. And until it does, every silence, every absence, and every subtle shift will continue to speak louder than any official statement ever could.